Hello. Alistair, one of the things I noted in your presentation was the fact that you'd discounted public open space requirements for housing. To your knowledge, has anyone ever done any work which has included public open space requirements? Because this is something that I feel is really important.
We deliberately added it in as an extra, or identified it as an extra cost, but because we didn't have the overall design criteria for the whole development. So the small site and the medium site were part of a bigger development, and therefore the open space and the landscaping were identified separately. So we identified, so if it was the medium site was delivered in isolation, there would be some open space and some landscaping to go with it. So we identified those as an extra cost, even though the majority of, in the reality, they would be included within the cost itself. But no, I don't know of any other costs where they've been included, because normally it's just part of the good design.
Does anyone else want to? Yeah.
Well, can I just expand on that? Because one of the things that came out of it is that, as Alistair said, the larger site, the SuDS was significantly cheaper than for the other two sites. But the thing that struck me about that site is that Upton was master planned to have the open swales within the development, and I think that is one of the key reasons why that ended up being a lot cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that we often talk about, I mean, I know Paul and I have discussed this, is not just cost but benefits and pricing, costing, if you like, a whole range of other things that a SuDS approach, or a good SuDS approach, might bring over and above the physical costs. I'm talking about, how do you measure a reduction in carbon, for instance? How do you measure, or can you account for carbon sequestration, increasing biodiversity, or how do you put a figure on a more interesting place?
You know.
No. But the purpose of our study was to try and provide some sort of harder facts on what the costs would be if it was delivered in a traditional approach, and what it would be if it was delivered in a SuDS approach. So, and we try to pick up the other ones, and the other, we did think about water quality aspects and the benefits of that, but it was very difficult to put numbers against it. So they thought they weren't quantified.
Brilliant. The gentleman in the sweater.
Hello, Martin Jones, Enfield Council. Just wondering, do the new national standards just apply to new developments? Because I was really impressed with the school scheme, and I know at Enfield there's a lot of need to extend existing schools. So would those extended parts fall into the requirements?
Yeah, any development, any construction with drainage implications that has any impact on drainage.
So the new car parks. Yeah, extensions.
Sorry, I changed that. Is any construction over half a hectare, that will be for the first 3 years. And then with the idea that will be extended to everything after that.
Okay.
But I would imagine, as a local authority, that you would push irrespective of whether there were standards. I mean, this is what we find in Leicestershire, is that Leicestershire have been incredibly open. Having been demonstrated 10 years or so that this works, and for the reasons that we've discussed, they're completely open. And there are virtually no drawbacks. How has that happened? You've got a cost saving, you've got fantastic places, you've got engagement of the community, support of the Environment Agency, a whole raft of things, as well as improving water quality and dealing with stormwater runoff quantities, yeah.
Great. I'll take the question right at the back. You notice I'm trying to get Paul to cover the most distance. It's intentional.
Hi there, it's James Hitching, Northumberland County Council. I've just got a question really regarding sloping sites. Seems to me that all the examples sort of today and in all the textbooks are quite a sort of utopia, flat site with a very sort of shallow gradient. I was just wondering if there is any sort of particular examples anyone can share today where we have a good sloping site and sort of what particular features were used.
Shall I start, because I have a picture? If you go to the first image, there's about a 9 metre level change across Forest Way School in Colville. It's on granite, so there's virtually nothing goes into the ground.
Is that one?
That's that one, yeah. So on the other side of that water, there's a drop to the playing fields, and on the uphill side, it carries on into Charnwood, onto Warren Hills. It's at about 200 metres above sea level, so it's quite exposed as well. And when it rains, it doesn't half chuck it down. It can be done.
Also, do you want to do it, or? Yeah. On the example in Bridget's presentation, the housing scheme that she showed a plan of in there, that's Uplands Housing in Stroud, and that is built on a hillside. And there's something probably in excess of a 10 metre drop from the top of the site to the bottom of the site. And I don't know if you can remember it, there was a basin in the centre of the housing development that all the water fed to. There's actually, when it rains, the design of the scheme has introduced a waterfall into the development, and that's a conscious decision. I think the waterfall's about 8 metres high when it rains. It's absolutely fantastic. So these are the kind of things you can do. Yeah, that's on susdrain. It's Uplands Housing and it's on susdrain. Again, it's one of these things, sloping sites, they do make it more difficult to design. You do have to think about it, but it's not a reason for not using SuDS. You've just got to put your brain into gear and get on with it.
I think I'm right in saying, Paul, that's the current susdrain study of the month, isn't it? Forest Way. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. There was one down here.
I actually think all of David's are on, or maybe there's Ulster, there's Forest Way, there's the MV16.
Kevin Tidy from Bracknell Council. Part of the standards will talk about viability of the use of sustainable drainage versus conventional drainage, if there is such a thing. Are there any tips that the panel can give to the SAB as to how you work out which one is the most cost effective? Because obviously that will depend upon the design parameters and also the approach which has been taken by the developer.
I think the majority of sites, SuDS will be cheaper if it's designed in properly from the start. So if the developer is starting out designing a SuDS system now, for the majority of sites, I think it will be cheaper and more effective. If they've half designed the site now and they need to try and retrofit something into it, it will end up being more expensive, I think. So having clear advice as early as possible in the process about what's acceptable and what's not, and how it's going to be adopted and associated costs with that. And I know nobody really knows that yet. It is really key, because I think that and convincing the developer of the benefits in terms of the landscape and the value rather than the costs, then I think you'll be a winner.
Presumably, if you have to, if you're trying to achieve the same water quality outcome in terms of protecting the watercourse, and you then have to install proprietary subsurface treatment systems on the end of your conventional system, that's going to whack up the costs. You didn't consider treatment in your conventional system?
No, not conventional system.
No, so they were essentially delivering different outcomes. Yeah.
Brilliant. That was, yes. And when you finish, we'll pass it to the person.
Okay. Hi, Vicky Borman from the London Borough of Hillingdon. I'm not sure who is best this question directed at, but I found it interesting that a number of the examples looked at obviously outsourced techniques like rainwater harvesting, particularly in the London boroughs. We have a high amount of water usage per head of population, a number of us obviously in over-abstracted areas as well. So we're really trying to push the use of outsourced techniques, particularly rainwater harvesting. And we often find there are a lot of hindrances, and a number of people come up with a number of excuses of why they can't employ that, usually because of costs and other things. There are a number of examples, I think a number of you have used, where rainwater harvesting and other techniques have been used together. So have you got any suggestions, any good examples and other things that we can go back to these queries on?
Shall I do? I've shown you some examples, haven't I?
Yeah.
Yeah. My job then. The rainwater harvesting isn't, strictly speaking, at least I wouldn't regard it as part of SuDS. So it's a technique which is allied to it, and it definitely forms part of what you might call water-sensitive urban design. But strictly speaking, we're talking about something else. We're talking about what would typically be dealt with by a building services engineer, as opposed to coming out into the landscape that we would deal with. What I do know from the Leicestershire examples is that this is regarded very much now, correct me if I'm wrong, as a standard. And having got a system that works, that's costable, the services engineers will use it because the client will want it, because it saves money. So I can't, sitting here, say, you know, this is how to do it, but there are systems out there which are in common use. There's an outfit I'm familiar with in Newark, where I live, which is Gusto Construction, who promote a rainwater harvesting system. The services engineers that we work with in Leicestershire are also based in Newark, so this seems to be a Nottinghamshire thing, perhaps. But I'm sure out there are examples of proprietary systems, and that's really what it amounts to, which are designed, tested, and costed, which you could throw back at a developer and say, well, this example here seems to work, this example here seems to work, why not employ it? And that certainly is the sort of method that we would use when we're trying to convince a client to employ a particular technology. Take them, show them, present them with the evidence, present them with the numbers, and then ask why, instead of doing it in a sort of vague way where you say, well, we'd like this, please, and then, you know, you've got no ammunition left at the end of it when they come back and say it's too expensive or it's too difficult.
Can I just check with Alice, there are others who are involved in the ongoing Syria SuDS costing project. Is the project likely to come out with the kind of answers on either individual measures, or is it going to be sort of site mixed type measures that will help decisions like that? We
ended up, in the back of the report, it comes out with costs against individual items. So each item is costed. It doesn't break it up into, the answers are there, but it's not easily decipherable. You know, there are some conclusions about this one was cheaper than this one. Rainwater harvesting was one of the more expensive of the options we looked at, because it was solely really looking at trying to intercept, to look at the interception storage, rather than provide some of the attenuation storage as well. And I know it is very different to a residential estate in a green field where each house has got their own recycling unit. You know, that's £2,000 or £3,000 per system, rather than if you've got blocks of development or more London development, it's much more effective to do that.
Can I just say, I think David's picked up an interesting point about the discussion of whether SuDS includes rainwater harvesting. Yeah. I think we're working on the basis that it does in terms of offering an interception storage. I think there's, but it is, again, it comes down to terminology in terms of, yes, SuDS and rainwater harvesting actually is water sensitive urban design in its bigger sense. So,
but the other bit we didn't pick up as part of our study is the benefits in water reduction. So, that wasn't quantified and costed because that was outside the bounds, but obviously it will provide that.
Okay.
In terms of, rainwater harvesting provides a volume control, is a volume control measure where you've got regular and relatively high demand, especially in communal facilities. It can work really well, and there could be, when there's a good level of demand, you've got a lot of opportunity for removing volume, and when it's expensive to do that in another route, then it may well end up becoming cost effective. I suppose the other thing is just the cost of water is too low generally, and that as soon as we don't have any rain for a couple of years, it will become very cost effective. So I suppose it's bearing that in mind. But I would very much see, the work that we've done on our UK SuDS website shows you how you can design, the additional storage you need to put into a rainwater harvesting system over and above just what you need to provide for the demand, so that you can get attenuation in there as well. So if you can provide additional capacity and deliver on multiple objectives of the standards, then you might. But I think at the moment that there possibly people aren't investigating all those options and looking at the cost of delivery.
Okay.
Ruth Seeger, London Borough of Tower Hamlets. Quite a lot didn't seem so applicable to very urban areas. Now, where we are, there is an awful lot of development. There is an opportunity there to put in a lot of SuDS. There's big developments with developers who have money, and we put requirements in there, and they will meet them. And I'm wondering if the costings included this. We are working on this, and so, for example, there are savings that they will make from reduction in water rates if they don't tip their waste into the sewers, and that makes something. Now, for some bigger developers, that may be useful. There may be other sort of savings, but it would be useful to have this for the smaller people, the housing associations. If we want to persuade them to go in with us, this sort of information really would be very useful. And I'm wondering if that is covered, because that is really where, I think in very urban areas where there is the opportunity to deliver a great deal of SuDS.
In terms of rainwater harvesting or SuDS in general?
No, I didn't mean rainwater SuDS. We're putting rain gardens in, we're putting tree pits in the roads and things. But it feels like, there's not so much information on cost. There's clearly benefits there, which we can work out on biodiversity and green grids, etc., as well as picking up a bit of water. But, and the costings, the savings, all these would be good arguments, and I wonder if it's covered.
It's not covered in our report, because we only have those 3 case studies. But I know of quite a few big developments in London that use SuDS, and I'm not sure quite how best to get that information back out.
Yeah, we have difficulty getting case studies, and we B have real difficulty getting anything with any tangible cost information. So, as David knows, so it's not for lack of trying. It's just trying to find someone who collects that cost information and is willing to share it. So.
There are those. That Islington case study is on. There's an Islington case study on the susdrain website that was costed up for DEFRA as part of their original impact assessment for the standards. So that has got costs associated with it. In terms of cost savings, so for not discharging surface water to a water company sewerage system, I think it's very variable around the country. Severn Trent, I think, give reductions. Thames don't. Or do?
They do.
They do. Yeah. Okay. So, and do they give 100% rebate on surface water?
It's very significant.
Yeah.
So for it to be not sort of known about and not included, there's not a lot of opportunities that would go begging.
Thanks for that. I'm sure the project team will take that on board for that, because again, yeah, you can just get such information from the water companies. I think you've got just in front, Paul, just here, one more. Again, please feel free, if somebody asks a question and you've actually got an example for something you've done in your local authority, let me know, because I'm quite happy as well that we get your views and experiences in addition to the ones of the people here.
Brian Richards, Dorset County Council. I'm aware that the task and finish groups are looking at whether local standards can trump national standards through the local flood risk management strategy. I'd like your views on what that would mean across the country if you had a diverse range of standards being developed.
I think it might be better if Kevin answers that question, as he's on the task and finish group.
I think what you can say is that the only way that local standards would apply is if they are part of a planning standard. The actual SuDS standards themselves are national, and that's what the drainage application will be checked against. The only local standards you may have are those which come out from a local flood risk management strategy, which may have an effect. And we are trying to make sure that is covered in the standard, but generally most of the standards will be national. There will be some cases where you might want to have greater flows than Greenfield, for example. There are some examples which we have looked at, but generally speaking they will be national standards. We don't want a plethora of local standards so that every SAB is different. No, if there's something specific which is arguable as needed as part of your flood risk management strategy, then it would be probably reasonable for that to be applied as part of your interpretation of the national standards, bearing in mind that which is one of the reasons why the national standards are not too prescriptive.
What sort of thing were you thinking about? What sort of thing were you thinking about?
I'm suggesting potentially tightening the standards, and it may be that the local authority's already got some design standards in place for the individual catchments, and they're quite successfully using those at the moment, and the temptation would be to incorporate those into the local flood risk management strategy, and that, in theory, would trump these very vague national standards.
We've done that.
Okay.
We've got planning policies that exceed, planning standards exceed SuDS, and then the local, the flood, the local flood authority standards, which are ours, then follow theirs.
I mean, as an example, I know Northamptonshire are looking in at about a 1 in 200 year standard in and around part of the catchment, because that's been part of their planning policy for, I don't know, the last 5-6 years, because of the historical flooding problems in Northampton and the historical setup of that part, the river system in there. So how that will work out in time, I don't know, but they're investigating that possibility.
Well, it looks like there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff with the local and national. I mean, hopefully they'll at least be aligning in similar directions. And hopefully the cop-out will be that the national is high level enough that within reason, unless one is really doing something crazy, you should be able to link them together. Well, I'll leave that for people to interpret. Yes, please.
Hi, Eloise from Islington Council. This question's for Bridget. With the SuDS design standards, the national standards, are they going to be linked to the national practice policy guidance that's just been out for consultation at the moment? I note that the design event definition of the 1 in 100 year flood didn't include any reference to climate change factor, so just wanted some clarification on that.
Is that the National Planning Policy Framework you're talking about? No?
No, the guidance, the National Planning Practice Guidance that was out for consultation.
There is, I'm not entirely sure of the document you're referring to, actually. Well, is it a document associated with the standards, specifically?
It's basically they've replaced all the PPSs with a national planning guidance that's web-based.
Okay. National Planning Policy Framework. I think that does include climate change allowance, doesn't it? Yeah, and the technical guidance to the NPPF, there is a table with climate change allowance factors which you apply to rainfall, and that table will, I think, probably be lifted and put into the guidance on the standards, I assume. Something like that. I know it's in I know I lifted it for the British standard on surface water flood risk, so it's definitely in there, so that will be the same.
I think the challenge here is there is the NPPF, there is the flood risk guidance that goes with it, and I know that has been updated and is currently in a draft form, which is probably, is it the draft of the update to the flood risk guidance or NPPF that you're talking about, which probably most people are not aware of?
No, it's the planning guidance. So it discusses flood risk, how developers are meant to calculate flood risk, but doesn't link back to.
Previously, they were saying use the PPS 25.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now they've got
and it doesn't seem to be a clear link back to what you're doing. So I think that might be just something to have a look at.
The SuD standards will be the defined standards against which drainage systems will be assessed. So,
I think it's a classic case of making sure that CLG and DEFRA talk to each other.
I hope that's
I'm sure hopefully that's been noted, and that's something that the guidance, because I guess even the current NPPF and the others, they tend to talk about the standard, but then somewhere at the end it then talks about taking account of climate change, but that's not always all the way through. But I'm sure you will try to link those in finalising the guidance. This is all different, really, isn't it?
In the technical guidance note that goes with the NPPF, it does have that table in it. That's the same table as what PPS 25, so it's in there somewhere.
Great. The next question, yes, please.
Where you go?
I should probably just read the guidance, and I wouldn't have to keep asking questions. But it's just about like highways, really, and roads. Is it included as well? So, because it seems to me like, especially with water quality, it's a huge issue, and I wonder, is that being dealt with? The like Transport for London, for example, I don't know if they're here today, but they probably should be, and Highways Services or Highways Agency should be involved in this discussion as well. I imagine they are.
Yeah, I mean, the Highways Agency they're under separate legislation, aren't they? Correct me if I'm wrong here. But the Highways Agency have really got this bottomed out. They've got their own procedures. They've got highways advice notes that tell you how to do risk assessments on water quality. And they've got the evidence base to show how to design a surface water management scheme to deal with the water quality issues from highways. And it is one of the things that we've been looking at in terms of the SuD standards and the SuDS manual, as to whether we can sort of nick their ideas and apply them to developments. But it's going to be difficult to do that, simply because it is purely set up to do highway runoff. But in terms of highways in a new development, you've got to deal with a runoff from those in the same way that you would any other surface in there, whether it's a car park or whatever.
Anybody else? Okay, I assume that there are loads of local authority people here today, and I guess very soon you'll all start dealing with this in earnest if you're not already in some way. I mean, is there anything today that you've heard and you're still saying, well, that still doesn't deal with this thing or still doesn't deal with that thing? Is there any concern on the technical aspects of dealing with this? Obviously, there's no person from DEFRA here, but these are the people primarily who are writing a lot of the technical bits. So if there are, this is a good opportunity really. Are there still some technical concerns you have on any aspect of SuDS that you'd like to ask? Yes.
Thank you. My name is David Williams. I work for Luton Borough Council. This is a sort of a sideways technical question, and the reason I say that is because we are trying to develop our own SuDS and SAB guidance. We've got a draft document, and it is going the rounds at the moment internally, because we clearly have to link up with our planning colleagues. My difficulty is how inclusive to make the document. At the moment, it doesn't include, for example, it doesn't include any examples or this is how you do it. It's more the document, if you don't achieve these standards, and it's predominantly the national standards, which we've sort of tweaked a little bit. If it doesn't meet these standards, we won't adopt it. But we're not telling them in our guidance how to achieve that. There are loads of references in there to the SuDS manual, and of course it'll be updated to the new one, to the NFPPF and its technical guidance and so on. But those are all extra documents that the people have got to read, and with absolutely no disrespect to anybody here, the SuDS manual is, how shall I put this, a doorstop. Clearly, I'm not going to produce a guidance that includes everything in all of those documents, because they'll never read it. So what's the best compromise?
So we're trying to split the revised version of the manual into a section of early chapters, which are basically the sort of philosophy and principles of SuDS. So hopefully you'll be able to direct people to read the first 5 chapters, which has a chapter on sort of the philosophy of managing hydraulics, the philosophy of managing water quality, philosophy, and then bring it all together, how to plan your SuDS system for the site without addressing design criteria and numbers, design calculation methods or anything. So the first 5 chapters hopefully will be not too long and full of images and inspirational and visionary, and so that everyone understands what a SuDS approach to drainage is. And then once that's, hopefully once they've read that, then they can dip into the bits of the technical bits of the manual that they need to. So I suppose hopefully that's recognising that there has been a problem with the doorstop issue, and that, and also I think this is right to say it's going to be downloadable as chapters, so you can very much just pick out the bits that you want people to read as PDFs and just send those bits on to developers or whatever.
And there's also a bank of case studies on susdrain to be used.
And also those case studies. We're not going to try and repeat case study material because there is so much on susdrain. All we're going to do is pick out elements of those case studies that demonstrate particular points within the manual. So hopefully it will all work.
Yeah, I mean, the point of picking out those particular elements is that we're actually going to have worked examples to show people how to do the design aspects of different parts of the system, and then hopefully join it all up at the end. I think that's about right, isn't it? So we are going to try and explain to people how to do it. It's not just a list of this is what you do. It will have some practical examples. And you're one of the people that came to the SuDS course and had to carry it home with you, aren't you?
My arms are 3 inches longer than they used to be.
I think hopefully also the worked examples will be much better. I think that there are things that aren't great in the current manual, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to make those much more closely aligned with the standards, with delivering and make it much more logical, so that people can really say, okay, I understand how interception and storage is dealt with and how I calculated it, and then I understand how attenuation is. That's the aim. So hopefully also you might be able to use those worked examples as a more direct tool for engagement.
Yes, because the other element of it is, as the SAB, we've got to be able to look at someone's design and say, well, you haven't taken that into account, or that's brilliant, tick BG, you get your approval, your adoption. So thank you very much, that's very helpful.
Actually, just trying to draw those responses together. What I hear there is you're developing your local things to support the national standards, and there are all these other things out there. I mean, realistically, given that we've got people here who are both developing or updating the SuDS manual, as well as perhaps being involved in the technical guidance that's going to support the national standards, is there really a lot more that local authorities should be doing in terms of their local? A lot of people actually going too deep, such that by the time this guidance is out, they will really have just replaced or done again most of the things that are out there. I'm just trying to get a feel for what's going to come out of those guidance, given that people are going to have that in by April 2014. Do people really need to go into a lot more?
I think there's a degree of frustration in lead local authorities in that we are waiting for it to come out and we haven't seen it. And the temptation is to try and develop something in the interim, because we've got developers coming to our doorstep now because they know next April we'll become the SuDS approving body. So what do we do in the interim?
Big challenge. I'll just take, I know Andy has had his hand up for a while, and then after that I'll come back.
Andy Hardstaff from Hertfordshire County Council. To kind of answer Fola's question about anything today, well, no, I think the technical stuff is proven. My big concern is around the design, because a lot of this is, enlightened people involved in the commission and enlightened people involved in the design, and the SuDS is thought about at an early stage, and that's key. And in terms of our local guidance, we describe a journey. We involved at the beginning, you involved us halfway through, and then at the end, and it'll be no problem. It will be a nice, smooth journey. You come to us with something fully designed at the end, and we don't understand where you've come from, it's going to be much more difficult. So, don't blame us if it takes a long time to determine. One of the problems that we're seeing now is, although the new SAB regime, when it happens, is linked to the planning system, it's separate to the planning system. And the SuDS application is a one-shot, whereas the process through planning can be, a master plan, outline, and then going on to detail. And the difficulty is, the journey we would like, it doesn't happen with the application in terms of it being signed off, because people will be in the planning system and they may do outline with detail in a small bit, but you can't really determine the SuDS scheme at that point, and we're really struggling to understand how we're going to integrate all this, because ideally we would like a kind of an outline SuDS application, an interim one, and then the final detailed and the sign-off. And you could perhaps do the detailed and the sign-off with the adoption, but that not all schemes will be adopted. So it's going to be really difficult, I think, to get the kind of influence we need, influence and understanding of the design process that we need in order to do this smoothly and effectively. And I just think we're just going to end up with lots of dog's breakfast at the end, lots of appeals and lots of time in court. But
before I bring that to the people here, I assume there are probably local authorities here who are either single tier or two tier, because I know in terms of planning it's a completely different situation. Is it worth just giving us a feel for how you are hoping or planning to deal with that issue at the moment, before we actually try and see how that then links with what the national standards is trying to suggest you do?
Are there any planners in the room? Okay, that's probably the challenge that we have, in as much that as drainage engineers and drainage champions, we're not managing to make it appeal and sound sexy enough to planners until they're going to be sat around a SAB table at some stage, hoping to have intelligent and engaging conversation with the SAB officer and also the developers.
If I give the example of how I'm a drainage engineer, but I sit in planning, so I'm quite unique in that respect. At the moment, it works quite well for us in that I am involved in the planning process. I give early comments within the planning process. I talk to our landscape architects, I talk to our biodiversity colleagues, and sometimes we can get some really good schemes because we're talking early within the planning process. I have real concerns similar to Andy about how that will work with sort of the outline, particularly with the negotiations that go on in planning terms of all of the discharge of conditions of things that actually affect drainage, but actually are under a separate condition. So if you, as soon as you start making changes to some of the landscape features, well, that on the drainage and all sorts of other things, as well as negotiations that are going on for biodiversity, etc. And all of those things have an impact. So actually separating the whole system is a concern. And similar to other local authorities, we will be doing our own local guidance for SuDS because there are specific things that aren't covered by the national guidance about things for sort of local design, how my highways team will want to maintain things and what specific sort of materials they would want to use, just because there's limited storage available for them to store absolutely every different type of permeable paving under the sun. So there will be specific things that they will be asking for that they just won't be able to adopt other things from. So yes, there is a need for local standards, I think.
Obviously, there's a very big issue there. I mean, I just wonder, are there any of the other even single tier where the planning and SAB functions sit in the same authority? How are you at the moment linking or trying to link the planning and the SAB functions, and are you getting any joys, or are there big challenges at the moment?
Yeah, I'm beginning to wonder if there's problems that I just haven't seen, but originally the SuDS started off with planning and it moved to us in highways, transportation highways, also lead local flood authority. And but our planning colleagues developed planning policies, and they were integrated into the surface water management plan, action plan, and then into our SuDS guidance. And now, you know, we realise that some SuDS applications will come in with planning applications, and some will come in separately. But it seems like a quasi-planning process, more than any quasi-highway authority process, if you see what I mean. And so we're now sort of beginning to talk to them about how just the mechanics of getting that through, so that we don't have things being given planning permission and not SAB permission, and to sift them out. So I think it seems to be rather than a matter of principle, which doesn't seem to be the problem, but just sort of pragmatics, so things don't get dropped and things get done when they're meant to be done because timescales are slightly different. So I think it's just, you know, not much more than a flow chart. I mean, of course, it is a bit much more than a flow chart. And what's gone well have been our colleagues in planning have been really, really up for this, and that always helps, doesn't it, if people work with you.
Brilliant. I just wonder, bringing it back to the table, and Paul, feel free to chip in because you're involved in the national standards. Is there anything that's being planned at the moment within the, probably not necessarily the national standards, but the emerging guidance in the national standard that's going to give some comfort to that link, or is it just something that will have to be worked out at each local authority?
I think Kevin's probably best placed.
Yes. Yeah.
Because when I was involved in task and finish groups, it was a discussion.
Yeah, well, when we first looked at the guidance, we did hope that we could actually align the application process with planning to have outline and reserve matters and so on. It became clear after having worked on it for about 3 months that DEFRA suddenly said, no, you can't do that. So what we've had to do is write into the guidance that basically the SAB should talk to the planners. They need to influence the planners that what is required in order to ensure that anything that gets planning permission can actually be built with SuDS, which will meet the national standards. We've also put guidance in explaining that even though that the SAB may not be a statutory consultee, anyone can actually comment on a planning permission. And so there is guidance in there about making comments, either objections in principle or pointing out where changes ought to be made. And at the end of the day, the planning authority wouldn't be in a good position if they went against the guidance of the SAB and gave permission for something which cannot then be built, because obviously they could open themselves up to challenge. So it is a matter of, unfortunately, the SAB will need to knock on the door of the planners and try to make sure that these linkages are in place, and also with any other of the consultees, especially the Environment Agency, and obviously your own higher authority colleagues. So that is written into the guidance that all of these linkages need to be made.
Thank you very much for that. I think it's really useful to have in here. Now I've got one final question, and I want to bring it back to the technical side. I mean, we really had to go into the standards, because I know it's the elephant in the room, so I allowed that to happen. Any other sort of points or questions relating to the technical aspects of the individual parts of them coming together while we've got these famous people sitting in front of us here? Yes.
Adam Littler from Hackney. One thing I've noticed hasn't been mentioned is green roofs today. And the only reason that I bring it up is we've been dealing with a development where the developer is point blank refusing to do it because he says there's no data out there on how much attenuation can be provided, anything like that. Is that something that's going to be included within or elaborated upon within the revised SuRIA document? How do we persuade the developers that it is worth doing?
You're lucky, because I've just finished the literature review for the SuDS manual on the green roof section of it, so it's all wandering around in my head, nice and fresh at the moment. I mean, green roofs are brilliant at providing interception, and that is what we're looking for from green roofs. So it stops, or it minimises the runoff for the frequent rainfall events up to 5 mil. If you shove a seed and mat on there, it'll get you 5 mil interception. If you are clever about the design of your roof and put thicker substrates on there, you'll get more interception. In a similar way to green roofs, sort of allied to it, we do a lot of work out in Greenwich and in Docklands on podium decks, where most of those aren't green roofs, they tend to be paved surfaces, but we're putting a paved surface with a storage system underneath the paved surface on the deck with a flow control. So we're attenuating sometimes 100-year events on a roof. Now, it all depends on structures, and it's all site specific, but again, if you think about it, it's a design problem, and you can do it if you've got a mind to do it.
Developer's argument with regard to saturation. Once it's saturated, it won't serve any functional purpose.
Once it's saturated, it's done its job because it's providing interception. The idea is that it's providing interception for the majority of rainfall events. So once you take that approach to designing a green roof, the saturation argument goes out the window. My argument, and it's some work that I'm looking at the moment, and I don't know which way the answer is going to go here, but my view is that particularly where you've got clay soils, a greenfield site eventually will have surface runoff from it because it becomes saturated, and we should be comparing the performance of green roofs not with normal roofs. We should be comparing the performance of green roofs against greenfield sites, and I think that will give us a slightly different picture of exactly how well they do perform in extreme events.
The other thing we've also used in the past is link them to biodiversity strategies and habitat creation on the roof as well. So you've got brown roofs as well as green roofs. So that can be another way of creating some habitat that offsets the development, the impact as well.
Sorry, I'll just, one final thing. In terms of the interception, that is explained. There's an Environment Agency green roof toolkit. It's somewhere on the Environment Agency's website, and I'll let you find it. But it does explain that interception and states quite clearly they can be used for that.
If we're going to be checking those plans and calculations that come back as a set function, things like substrate and that sort of thing, we're going to need to be factoring that into our volume and our flow calculations that we're going to do to cross-match, if you like, against their produced figures.
So in terms of the actual sort of absorption of water you can get in the green roof is.
I've noted that some sites that are including them are not including the green roof within the final calculation file that's coming back from the developers, and of course that's skewing, and vice versa, all the final volume flows from the site discharge and the greenfield runoff rates.
Yeah, well, it will do. I mean, the thing is that if you follow the design guidance that is in the SuDS manual at present, it is in the British standard, and will be in the national standards as they stand at the moment, assuming they stay the same. They all say that you should provide interception, and green roofs do that. As I said, the extent to which you get that interception will vary, but you subtract that. So if you've got 5 mil interception, you multiply that by the area of green roof and you subtract that storage from what you're providing at ground level. I mean, that's quite clear in all the guidance that's there at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to reinforce what Alistair said about this idea that green roofs or eco roofs or biodiverse roofs or whatever we're calling them aren't single function. So the benefits of adopting this sort of strategy cut across a range of things. Biodiversity is one, visual appearance is another, etc. So there's a very good planning argument actually for making roofs function in a biodiverse way or more biodiverse way, and there are BREEAM credits, for instance, or code credits available to very cheaply, actually, to get that. So another argument that you could use is, in conjunction with planning colleagues, what is this thing going to look like, and how is it going to perform in an ecological sense?
The other thing is which we will have to cover in the manual, is that when you then are testing the site for, say, a 1 in 100-year event, which I think you're saying they just removed the green roof from the equation, that's probably not right, but whether you put what percentage runoff you allocate to the green roof in that situation, whether you allocate it as a type 1 soil type 1 or and give it a 60% runoff, or whether and I think it's probably realistic to consider it as landscaping and not as an impermeable surface, but exactly what that proportion should be is something that we should probably will define in the manual, and hopefully Steve's bit of research that he's going to commission in the interim is going to give us the answer.
There is an equation that sets out depth of green roof versus impermeability.
Right.
I can't remember. Yeah, and I can't remember what.
I think there was a serious document specifically for
the green roof.
Yeah, I can't remember which one it was in.
And I think that is what the basis of the Green Roof Toolkit, isn't it?
It was, but the green roof toolkit changed after we prepared it. So the interception part of it is still there, but I think the table and the runoff coefficients were removed. I don't know why that happened, because we'd got plenty of evidence from a green roof installer who'd got a lot of green roof test beds that showed that, in actual fact, the probability of these things becoming saturated and a big event happening, you've got to look at that joint probability. and it, well, certainly the evidence we had that it wasn't that great, but other people might have different evidence.